In the golden age of British cinema, a dark secret lurked behind the velvet curtains of the West End and the studio gates of Elstree. While the cameras rolled on polite period dramas and raucous comedies, powerful men of a certain age sought the company of starlets young enough to be their granddaughters. It was an era where a leading role often came with a heavy price tag, the private affections of a fading icon. For many ambitious young women, the path to stardom required navigating the predatory whims of the industry's old guard. Today, we expose the 10 legendary actors who blurred the lines between mentorship and ownership, using their influence to secure companionship. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, was it love or was it leverage? Let us begin. Peter Sellers. In the mid-1970s, Peter Sellers was widely considered the greatest comedic genius Britain had ever produced. He was the man of 1,000 voices, the chameleon behind Inspector Clouseau, yet behind the mask lay a deeply troubled soul terrified of aging and irrelevance. By this decade, Sellers was not the vibrant young goon he once was. He was a man ravaged by a series of massive heart attacks, living with a pacemaker and a profound fear of his own mortality. He became obsessed with the idea that the company of young, beautiful women could somehow reverse the clock and restore his fading vitality. He did not just seek a partner, he sought a vessel of youth to consume, a dynamic that many in his circle found deeply disturbing. The object of his most intense and destructive obsession was the young actress Lynn Frederick. When they married in 1977, the visual contrast was stark enough to make the public gasp. Sellers was 51, but with his grey hair and fragile health, he looked decades older, while Lynn was a fresh-faced 22-year-old beauty, widely regarded as the rising English rose of cinema. To the cynical observers of the London film scene, the transaction was clear. Sellers purchased the illusion of virility and the adoration of a stunning young woman, and in return, he offered her the keys to the kingdom of Hollywood, a world she was desperate to conquer. Sellers used his immense influence to secure roles for his young bride, effectively buying her screen time with his star power. The most glaring example of this was the film The Prisoner of Zenda in 1979. Sellers, whose erratic behavior on set was legendary, insisted that Lynn be cast alongside him. It was a classic case of the package deal that powerful men in the industry often utilized. He dangled the promise of international stardom as the ultimate carrot, binding her to him not just with a wedding ring, but with the chains of professional dependency. He wanted to be her mentor, her lover, and her gatekeeper all at once. However, the reality behind the closed doors of their luxury home was far from a romantic mentorship. Sellers was notoriously possessive and pathologically jealous. He treated Lynn less like a wife and more like a prized possession that he had acquired at an auction. He monitored her movements, dictated her career choices, and demanded absolute devotion to feed his fragile ego. The role she had truly accepted was not on the screen, but in his private life, the role of the adoring nurse and muse to a fading giant. The industry whispered that she had traded her youth for his legacy, a gamble that came with a heavy psychological price. The tragedy of this arrangement culminated in Sellers' death in 1980. In a final act of control from beyond the grave, he left almost his entire vast fortune to Lynn, completely disinheriting his own children from previous marriages. It was the ultimate payment for her services as his final companion. The young actress, who had been promised the world, found herself the wealthy widow of a legend, but she was vilified by the press and the public. She had played the part he wrote for her perfectly, but the script ended in tragedy. Lynn Frederick never truly recovered from the toxic orbit of Peter Sellers, spiraling into despair and passing away herself at a tragically young age, a victim of a bargain she perhaps never fully understood. Sidney James. To the millions of British viewers who tuned in to the Carry On films, Sid James was the lovable, craggy-faced rogue with the dirty laugh that sounded like rocks tumbling in a dryer. He was the quintessential dirty old man of comedy, a character type he played with relish. However, by the 1970s, the line between his on-screen persona and his real-life desires had blurred into a dangerous obsession. Sid James was a man in his 60s, his health failing due to a lifetime of heavy smoking and gambling, yet he was desperately clinging to the illusion of his own virility. The target of his intense and overwhelming affection was the nation's sweetheart, the bubbly and blonde Barbara Windsor, who was nearly 25 years his junior. The relationship between Sid and Barbara was the worst-kept secret in the British film industry. While they played husband and wife or lovers on screen, Sid was using his immense power as the undisputed king of the Carry On franchise to manipulate reality. He reportedly influenced the casting decisions and the scripts, ensuring that he and Barbara were constantly thrown together in intimate scenes. In films like Carry On Henry, the script conveniently required the aging King Henry VIII, played by Sid, to chase the young, buxom maiden, played by Barbara. It was a classic case of life imitating art, but the power dynamic was strictly one-sided. Sid used the studio floor as his personal hunting ground, using his status to secure time and physical proximity to the young actress he idolized. For Barbara, the situation was a suffocating trap. Sid James was not just a co-star, he was a powerful figure who could make life on set incredibly difficult if he did not get his way. He showered her with expensive gifts, champagne, and promises that he would leave his long-suffering wife, Valerie, to be with her. It was the classic promise of the aging patriarch to the young muse, a dazzling lie designed to keep her compliant. The transaction was implicit, but clear. Barbara provided the companionship and the spark of youth that Sid craved, and in return, she received the protection of the show's biggest star. However, this protection often felt more like possession. Sid was notoriously jealous, monitoring her movements and sulking furiously if she paid attention to younger men. The darker side of this romance was Sid's volatility. He was a man from a different era, a rough diamond from South Africa who did not take rejection well. There were whispers of intense arguments in dressing rooms and moments where his affection bordered on intimidation. He was a man terrified of losing his grip on the industry and on the woman who made him feel young again. He used his influence to isolate her, creating a world where they were the only two people who mattered, all while his real family waited at home. The psychological toll on Barbara was immense. She was navigating the demands of a man who was old enough to be her father and who held her career in his nicotine-stained hands. The tragedy of Sid James reached its climax in 1976. He died on stage at the Sunderland Empire Theatre, collapsing during a performance. Legend has it that he was still pining for Barbara until his final breath, a man consumed by a passion that his heart literally could not withstand. His obsession with her had defined his final years, turning the Carry On sets into a stage for his own personal melodrama. He had leveraged his legacy to buy the time and affection of a young star, leaving behind a complicated history of power, lust, and the desperate sadness of a clown who was crying on the inside. Sid James remains a legend, but his treatment of Barbara Windsor serves as a stark reminder of the entitlement powerful men felt over their younger female co-stars in the 1970s. James Mason. James Mason was the possessor of the most distinctive voice in British cinema, a velvety, menacing baritone that could seduce an audience or chill them to the bone. By the 1970s, he was a certified legend, a veteran of Hollywood, and a man whose mere presence on a poster guaranteed distribution. However, behind the facade of the polished English gentleman, Mason was a man deeply susceptible to the allure of youth and the control that came with it. In 1969, on the set of the film Age of Consent in Australia, he met Clarissa Kay. The dynamic was a textbook cliché of the industry's power imbalance. He was the 60-year-old international superstar, and she was a struggling bit-part actress almost nearly half his age. The film itself was about an aging artist finding a young muse, and life imitated art in the most direct way possible. They married in 1971, and what followed was a decade where Mason used his immense professional weight to force the industry to accept his young wife. He became notorious for what producers called the package deal. If you wanted the gravitas of James Mason for your film, you often had to find a role for Clarissa Kay. This was not a request, it was an ultimatum. Mason, aware of his value to the studios, leveraged his legacy to buy screen time for a woman who, according to many critics and casting directors, lacked the talent to secure those roles on her own merit. He was effectively purchasing her career with his own reputation, a transaction that raised eyebrows across London and Hollywood. The most glaring example of this nepotistic arrangement came with the 1973 production of Frankenstein: The True Story. Mason, playing a lead role, ensured Clarissa was cast. Her presence on set was often a source of tension. Directors and fellow actors found themselves walking on eggshells, knowing that any criticism of her performance would be taken as a personal slight by the great James Mason. He was fiercely protective, almost to the point of paranoia, creating a bubble around her that no one was allowed to burst. He was the aging lion guarding his cub, using his roar to silence anyone who whispered that she was only there because of his wedding ring. However, the tragedy of this relationship was that the power dynamic eventually flipped. While Mason initially held all the cards, using his fame to elevate her, the isolation they built together eventually imprisoned him. Clarissa became the gatekeeper to the legend. In his later years, as his health declined, she reportedly controlled who could speak to him and who could visit, cutting him off from his children from a previous marriage. The man who had once bought her roles was now dependent on her for his daily existence. The industry saw this as a cautionary tale of a man who thought he could control youth, only to find that youth eventually controlled him. The Mason deal became a whispered warning in casting offices. It highlighted the rampant cronyism of the 1970s, where a powerful man's affection was a valid currency for a Screen Actors Guild card. James Mason remained a brilliant actor until the end, but his professional legacy in that decade is forever entangled with the awkward, forced performances of the wife he insisted on placing in the spotlight. He tried to build a pedestal for her, but in doing so, he only highlighted the artificial nature of her ascent. It was a romance built on the shaky foundations of professional leverage, proving that while you can buy a role, you cannot buy talent or respect. Richard Harris. In the early 1970s, Richard Harris was the undisputed king of the Hellraisers, a man whose reputation for drinking, fighting, and general debauchery was as legendary as his acting talent. He was the rough-hewn Irish lion of British cinema, a man who commanded the screen with a raw, visceral intensity. However, by the middle of the decade, the physical toll of his lifestyle was beginning to show. The wild nights were leaving their mark, and Harris, though still a force of nature, was a man in search of a new muse to rejuvenate his spirit. He found this fountain of youth in the form of Ann Turkel, a stunning American model and aspiring actress who was significantly younger than him. They met on the set of the film 99 44/100% Dead in 1974, and the attraction was immediate. For Harris, Ann represented a second chance at vitality. She was glamorous, tall, and possessed the kind of fresh-faced beauty that the fashion magazines of the era adored. They married almost immediately, and Harris, ever the dominant personality, took it upon himself to shape her career with the same ferocity he applied to his pub brawls. He did not just want a wife waiting at home, he wanted a partner who would share the spotlight, a visual confirmation of his continued virility. Consequently, the late 1970s saw a string of films where Richard Harris was the star, and Ann Turkel was miraculously cast as his leading lady or in a prominent supporting role. It was a pattern that critics of the time could not help but notice with a cynical raise of the eyebrow. The most notable examples of this professional nepotism included the disaster movie The Cassandra Crossing in 1976 and the action thriller Golden Rendezvous in 1977. In these productions, Harris used his considerable leverage as a bankable international star to ensure that Ann was part of the package. Producers, eager to secure the volatile but brilliant Harris, often acquiesced to his demands, viewing Ann's casting as the cost of doing business with a legend. For Ann, it was a golden ticket. She was thrust into major productions alongside icons like Sophia Loren and Burt Lancaster, positions that seasoned actresses would have killed for, all because she wore Richard's ring. However, the critical reception to these joint ventures was often unkind. While Harris was praised for his presence, Ann was frequently dismissed as merely decorative, a model trying to act. The industry whispered that she was only there because Harris could not bear to be apart from her, or perhaps because he needed to keep his young wife close in the predatory environment of film sets. The dynamic was clear. He was the gatekeeper, the mentor, and the lover who held the keys to the kingdom. He bought her visibility with his fame, using his clout to bypass the usual struggles of an acting career. It was a romantic gesture in his eyes, but to the outside world, it looked like a powerful man curating his own reality. The marriage, predictably, was as turbulent as Harris's reputation. The pressure of working together, living together, and navigating the vast difference in their experience levels eventually took its toll. While they divorced in the early 1980s, the films they made together stand as a testament to a specific moment in British cinema history. They capture a time when a leading man could dictate the casting of his lover, treating the film set as an extension of his domestic life. Richard Harris loved fiercely and possessively, and for a few years in the 1970s, he made sure that the world saw Anne Turkel exactly the way he saw her, as a star, simply because he said she was one. It was a grand, slightly tragic attempt to merge his professional dominance with his personal desire. Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison was known to the world as the quintessential English gentleman, the charming Professor Higgins from My Fair Lady, who could talk his way out of any situation. However, by the 1970s, the charm had curdled into arrogance. Sexy Rexy, as he was known in his prime, was now an aging lion with a glass eye and a temper that could clear a room in seconds. He was terrified of his fading relevance and the encroaching silence of old age. To combat this, Harrison did not just seek companionship, he sought an audience. He needed a young, beautiful woman to reflect his former glory back at him, a living prop to prove that he was still the alpha male of the British theatre scene. In 1971, he married Elizabeth Rees-Williams, a socialite who was significantly younger than him and the former wife of Richard Harris. But the true epitome of his granddaughter complex came later in the decade when he married Mercia Tinker, a woman 30 years his junior. Harrison used his knighthood and his immense wealth as a lure. He offered these young women a life of Mediterranean villas, high society galas, and the reflected glow of his legend. In exchange, he demanded absolute subservience. The role he cast them in was not on celluloid, but in the theater of his daily life. He required a full-time nurse, ego masseuse, and punching bag for his frustrations. The dynamic was brutally transactional. Harrison would parade his young wives at premieres and parties, showing them off like prized thoroughbreds. He used their youth to distract from his own frailty. But behind the closed doors of his tax exile homes, the atmosphere was toxic. He was known to be verbally abusive, treating his partners with a disdain that shocked their friends. He viewed them as employees in the business of being Rex Harrison, and if they missed a cue or failed to laugh at an anecdote he had told 1,000 times, his wrath was instantaneous. He had bought their time with his legacy, but he refused to give them any respect. For Mercia Tinker, the role of Lady Harrison was a golden cage. She was surrounded by luxury, but trapped by the demands of a man who refused to age gracefully. Harrison's obsession with youth was a vampire-like need to feed off their energy. He would often pit his wives against his children, creating a chaotic environment where he was the only sun around which the planets revolved. The industry whispered that these women had traded their freedom for a title, signing a contract with a man who was less of a husband and more of a dictatorial director of his own domestic drama. Rex Harrison died in 1990, playing the role of the Grand Patriarch to the bitter end. He left behind a trail of exhausted women who had given the best years of their lives to prop up his fragile ego. His story in the 70s is a stark reminder of the entitlement of the old guard. He believed that his talent gave him the right to own the people around him. He didn't just want a wife, he wanted a supporting actress who knew her lines, knew her place, and knew that the spotlight was never, ever meant for her. It was a masterclass in selfishness, performed by one of the greatest actors of his generation, Kenneth More. In the 1950s, Kenneth More was the undisputed golden boy of British cinema, the man who embodied the stiff upper lip and the heroic spirit of the war years in films like Reach for the Sky. But by the arrival of the 1970s, the industry had shifted dramatically. The demand for the polite, dashing officer class had evaporated, replaced by the gritty realism of a new generation. Kenneth was suddenly an aging lion in a jungle he no longer recognized, a man approaching his 60s who was terrified of becoming obsolete. It was during this period of professional vulnerability that he entangled his life with the young and vibrant actress Angela Douglas, a woman who was 26 years his junior. To the tabloids, it was a scandal. To Kenneth, it was a desperate grasp at the vitality he felt slipping away. The dynamic of their relationship was visibly paternal. Kenneth, with his crinkling eyes and fatherly demeanor, nicknamed Angela Shrimp, a moniker that infantilized her even as he paraded her through the high society of London. He was the established governor of the acting world, and she was the wide-eyed starlet known for her appearances in the Carry On films. While their love was genuine, the transaction was undeniable. Kenneth offered the security, the status, and the connections of a national treasure. In return, Angela provided the adoring gaze of a woman young enough to be his daughter, validating his masculinity at a time when casting directors were beginning to look past him. Kenneth used his immense influence to smooth the path for his young partner. In the insular world of British film and television, being Mrs. Kenneth More was a passport that opened doors which might otherwise have remained closed. He facilitated introductions and ensured she was seen at the right tables, effectively merging her career with his own fading trajectory. The industry whispered that he was keeping her close, not just out of love, but out of a possessive need to be the center of her universe. He was the mentor who had become the master, guiding her every move with the experience of a veteran who knew how the game was played. However, the granddaughter dynamic came with a heavy price for the young actress. As the 1970s progressed, Kenneth's health began to decline. The vibrant hero of the screen was slowly replaced by a man struggling with the onset of Parkinson's disease. The role Angela had unwittingly auditioned for shifted from that of a glamorous young wife to that of a full-time nurse and caretaker. She had traded her youth for his legacy, only to find herself caring for a man who was physically and mentally disintegrating before her eyes. The age gap, once a source of scandalous excitement, became a cruel reality of biology. Kenneth More's reliance on Angela was absolute. He needed her youth to keep the shadows at bay, feeding off her energy to maintain the illusion that he was still the leading man. It was a relationship defined by the classic imbalance of the era, the aging star who fears the final curtain, and the young woman who is swept up in his orbit, only to realize that the price of admission is her own independence. They remained together until the end, but the image of the young Shrimp guiding the frail, elderly icon through the streets of London remains a poignant symbol of the bargains made in the name of love and fame. Benny Hill. Alfred Hawthorne Hill, known to the world as Benny Hill, was the undisputed king of British television comedy in the 1970s. His show was a global phenomenon, watched by millions who tuned in to see his slapstick routines and his trademark chases. However, at the center of his comedic empire was a controversial element that became his defining legacy: the Hill's Angels. Benny was a man deeply insecure about his appearance and terrified of genuine intimacy, yet he surrounded himself with a harem of scantily clad, stunningly beautiful young women. To the public, it was harmless fun. To the critics of the time, it was a meat market, where an aging, lonely man used his immense power to purchase the presence of youth. The casting process for the Hill's Angels was notorious. Young, aspiring actresses and dancers, desperate for a break in the competitive world of television, would line up to audition for Benny. The primary qualification was not comedic timing or acting ability, but physical perfection and a willingness to be objectified. Benny, playing the role of the lecherous uncle on screen, was effectively the gatekeeper to stardom for these women. He offered them a role, but the role was to be silent, smiling, and scantily dressed, a prop to be chased by a man old enough to be their father. He bought their bodies for the screen, trading the exposure of his high-rated show for their compliance in his fantasy. Behind the scenes, the dynamic was complex and somewhat tragic. Benny was not the sexual predator his on-screen persona suggested. He was a voyeur. He was a man who lived a solitary existence in a rented flat, hoarding his wealth, yet on set, he was the emperor. He used the Hill's Angels to create a buffer against his own loneliness. He would invite them to dinner, not for romance, but to be seen with them, to validate his status as a television titan. The industry whispered that he was buying companionship under the guise of professional employment. The women knew the deal. Look pretty, laugh at the jokes, and you get the paycheck and the credit. However, the role of a Hill's Angel became a double-edged sword. While it provided immediate visibility, it often trapped these young actresses in a stereotype that was hard to shake. They were branded as Benny's girls, a label that carried a certain stigma in the serious acting world. Benny, in his pursuit of a televised harem, inadvertently commodified an entire generation of dancers, reducing them to visual gags. He was the puppet master, pulling the strings of these young women, ensuring they were always available to stroke his ego and feed the illusion of his desirability. As the 70s turned into the 80s, the tide of public opinion began to turn against this granddaughter dynamic. The sight of an increasingly elderly man chasing young girls around a park became less funny and more predatory. Benny Hill's reliance on this trope ultimately led to his downfall, but for a decade, he was the most powerful man in British TV, and he used that power to curate a world where he was the adored center of attention. He died alone, a millionaire who had spent a fortune hiring the affection he could never quite secure in his real life. His story is a somber reflection on the transactional nature of fame, where youth is a currency and the aging star is the desperate buyer. Richard Burton. By the middle of the 1970s, Richard Burton was less of a man and more of a walking myth, a legend crumbling under the weight of his own excess. The Welsh wizard, whose voice was once described as the sound of the earth trembling, was physically and emotionally exhausted. His tumultuous, twice-broken marriage to Elizabeth Taylor had left him drained, and his legendary consumption of alcohol was rapidly accelerating his aging process. At 50 years old, he looked decades older, his face etched with the deep lines of a life lived at full throttle. He was a king without a queen, terrified of the silence that awaited him in his Swiss tax exile. He needed a distraction, a muse and a nurse, and he was willing to pay a king's ransom to secure one. In 1976, he set his sights on Susie Hunt, a stunningly beautiful model and the estranged wife of the Formula One champion James Hunt. Susie was young, glamorous, and possessed the kind of aristocratic poise that Burton, the miner's son, had always fetishized. However, the start of their union was transactional in the most literal sense. James Hunt, known for his own wild lifestyle, famously demanded a settlement to grant the divorce. Burton, desperate to possess the young beauty and prove to the world that he could still attract a prime partner, reportedly paid the divorce settlement himself. It was, in the eyes of the cynical British press, a transfer fee paid by one aging alpha male to a younger one for the company of a woman. The dynamic of their marriage was stark. Burton showered Susie with the kind of wealth that would make a pharaoh blush. He bought her furs, diamonds, and properties, using his checkbook to build a fortress of luxury around her. In return, he expected her to be the antidote to his demons. He wanted a granddaughter figure who would nurse him through his bouts of illness, tolerate his dark moods, and look decorative on his arm at premieres. He was purchasing her youth to mask his own rapid decay. The industry watched with a mixture of pity and fascination as the great Richard Burton, once the fiery Heathcliff of the stage, was reduced to buying affection to soothe his bruised ego. For Susie, the role of Mrs. Richard Burton was a gilded cage. She was thrust into the role of caretaker for a man who was often incapacitated by his lifestyle. While he used his influence to introduce her to the elite circles of Hollywood and London, the reality was a lonely existence spent managing the decline of a genius. Burton was possessive and jealous, terrified that she would realize the disparity in their vitality and leave him. He tried to bind her to him with generosity, turning their relationship into a series of grand gestures designed to guilt her into staying. He was acting out the role of the benevolent patriarch, but the script was tragic. The marriage lasted 6 years, a testament to Susie's patience, but it ultimately collapsed under the weight of Burton's addiction and his lingering obsession with Elizabeth Taylor. Richard Burton's pursuit of Susie Hunt remains a defining image of his twilight years in the 70s. It was the act of a man who believed that love was something that could be negotiated, acquired, and insured. He tried to buy a second youth through her, but found only that time is the one thing that not even the highest-paid actor in the world can afford. He died just a few years later, a man who had everything and nothing, leaving behind a legacy of brilliance and a cautionary tale about the hollowness of buying companionship. Cary Grant. Archibald Leach, known to the world as Cary Grant, was the ultimate transatlantic export, a man born in the working-class streets of Bristol who transformed himself into the epitome of Hollywood sophistication. By the 1970s, Grant had retired from the silver screen, having walked away after Walk, Don't Run in 1966, but he remained a titan of the industry, sitting on the boards of major corporations like Fabergé and MGM. He was a man who had everything: wealth, status, and an impeccable legacy, but in his personal life, he was engaged in a desperate struggle to curate his own happiness. At the age of 69, a time when most men are settling into a quiet retirement, Grant began a 4-year relationship with the British photographer Maureen Donaldson, who was just 26 years old. The 43-year age gap was so significant that the press frequently mistook her for his daughter or even his granddaughter. The dynamic of their relationship was a classic, if disturbing, example of the Pygmalion effect. Grant did not just want a lover, he wanted a project. He used his immense wealth and experience to try and mold Maureen into his ideal woman, treating her like a raw piece of clay that needed shaping by a master sculptor. He dictated her wardrobe, throwing out her jeans and t-shirts and replacing them with the elegant, conservative couture that he preferred. He criticized her accent, her mannerisms, and her career choices, attempting to smooth out her rough edges to fit the polished image of a Cary Grant companion. He was the aging director of a movie that was his own life, and she was the starlet who was expected to follow the script without question. Grant's control extended far beyond the superficial. He was terrified of being alone and used his status to isolate Maureen from her peers. He would often disparage her friends and create an environment where she was entirely dependent on him for social interaction and professional validation. While he did not need to buy her film roles, she was a photographer, not an actress, he used his connections to open doors for her in the world of journalism, effectively purchasing her career opportunities with his name. It was a gilded cage, lined with first-class tickets and invitations to the most exclusive parties in London and Los Angeles, but a cage nonetheless. The industry whispered that the great Cary Grant was terrified of his own mortality and was using Maureen's youth as a shield against the inevitable. The relationship was fraught with tension. Grant's insecurity manifested as a controlling obsession. He would reportedly call her incessantly if she was out of his sight, demanding to know who she was with. He was a man who had spent a lifetime being looked at, but in this relationship, he was the watcher, scrutinizing her every move for signs of betrayal. The granddaughter dynamic was palpable. He was the wise, wealthy patriarch dispensing advice and money, and she was the rebellious youth trying to find her own identity in his massive shadow. The transaction was clear. She gave him the vitality of her 20s, and he gave her the keys to the kingdom of the elite. By 1977, the relationship collapsed under the weight of Grant's suffocating expectations. Maureen left him, unable to breathe in the rarefied air of his perfectionism. Cary Grant was left alone again, an aging icon in an empty mansion, surrounded by the ghosts of his past. His attempt to buy a second youth through Maureen had failed, proving that while he could charm the entire world with a single look, he could not negotiate with the passage of time. The story of their union in the 70s remains a fascinating study of the power imbalance between a legend in his twilight and a young woman just beginning her life. A script that even Hollywood would have found too cliché to produce. Terry Thomas. If there was one face that defined the upper-class British scoundrel, it was the gap-toothed grin of Terry Thomas. With his cigarette holder, monocle, and waistcoat, he was the living embodiment of the charming cad, a man who could steal your wallet and your heart with a well-timed ding-dong. By the early 1970s, however, the laughter was beginning to sound a little hollow. Terry Thomas was 60 years old, a man whose entire persona was built on a boundless energy that was rapidly fading. He was terrified of the silence that came when the cameras stopped rolling, and he sought to fill that void with the ultimate symbol of virility, a woman young enough to be his granddaughter. In 1971, on the sun-drenched island of Ibiza, he met Belinda Cunningham. She was a striking beauty of just 21 years old, a girl with dreams of a glamorous life who was completely swept up in the orbit of the famous comedian. The dynamic of their union was a textbook example of the granddaughter complex that plagued the industry's aging elite. Terry Thomas was nearly 40 years her senior, a man who belonged to the pre-war era of music halls and gentlemen's clubs, while Belinda was a child of the psychedelic 60s. To the outside world, and certainly to the cynical British press, the transaction was transparent. Terry Thomas was buying her youth and vitality with the promise of a jet-set lifestyle and access to the inner sanctum of the film world. He dangled the keys to his villa and his contacts book, effectively casting her in the role of the star's wife, a position that many young women of the era coveted as a shortcut to fame. He treated her like a prize he had won at a fairground, a visual confirmation that the old lion still had his teeth. However, the role that Belinda had auditioned for turned into a tragedy almost immediately. Shortly after they met, in 1971, Terry Thomas was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. The man who had promised her a life of endless parties, film premieres, and Mediterranean sunsets was suddenly facing a debilitating and degenerative illness. The cruelty of the situation was immense. He had sought a young mistress to validate his vitality, but instead, he required a young nurse to manage his decline. He spent his fortune trying to maintain the illusion of their golden life, burning through millions of pounds on medical treatments and lavish gestures to keep her happy, terrified that she would leave him as his body betrayed him. The industry watched in hushed silence as the once great Terry Thomas deteriorated. He continued to work, accepting roles in lesser films like The Vault of Horror and Spanish Fly in the mid-70s, purely to fund the lifestyle he had promised his young bride. He was selling his legacy, piece by piece, to pay for the role he was playing in his own marriage. He was desperate to prove that he could still be the provider, the alpha male, even as his hands shook and his famous voice began to falter. It was a heartbreaking performance, a man trying to outrun his own biology to keep the affection of a woman who had been born when he was already a middle-aged star. By the end of the decade, the money was gone. The couple was forced to sell their dream villa, and Terry Thomas, the man who had once epitomized British luxury, ended his days in a charity-run nursing home in Surrey. Belinda stayed with him, transitioning from the glamorous young trophy to the exhausted caregiver, a role she had never anticipated when she accepted his offer in Ibiza. His story in the 1970s is a poignant reminder of the high cost of the granddaughter fantasy. Terry Thomas tried to buy a second youth, but he ended up bankrupting himself, both emotionally and financially, proving that the one thing a star cannot negotiate with is the relentless march of time.